Web panels are the most versatile objects provided by GeneXus. As we've seen in some examples, all web panels have a web form, consisting of a web page that enables us to design and provide a variety of functionalities. In the last example, we saw that the variables that we include in the web form are enabled for the user to assign values to them. This means that they are input controls. In other words, they are not read-only. Specifically, this variable, of the dynamic combo type, expected the user to select one country from those loaded in the combo. After pressing the button List Attractions by Country, the associated event would be executed, invoking the PDF file containing a list of attractions in that country. In these other variables, the user would enter a range of attraction names so that when this other button is pressed, the PDF list showing the attractions within the range received by parameter would be invoked. Remember the layout. And in the source, we programmed the database query with the for each, filtering by name. But why do we define these queries through PDF listings instead of doing it directly on the screen where the user is required to enter data for the filters? Why not add here a grid showing the desired attractions instead of the buttons? Apart from allowing the definition of variables to be used in actions programmed in buttons, web panels allow us to implement interactive queries to the database, which is in fact their main purpose. The term interactive implies that it's possible for the user to enter many different values in variables, in the web page, and then query the database for data matching the values entered, using them as filters, as we will see next. Let's now save this web panel with a different name. We will be implementing something similar to a work with element, so we will call it www attractions from scratch. We remove the buttons and the associated events because they will no longer be necessary. And now we insert a control of the grid type below the variables. A screen opens up in order to select the attributes and/or variables that will be this grid's columns. Since we want to show the same we showed on the PDF listings, we select the attraction ID, attraction name, attraction photo, and country name attributes, and then press OK. We will then see that a grid has been created with these columns. Let's move country name here. We may change the column titles by editing the properties of each attribute comprised in the grid columns. The attributes in a web panel form are, by default, output attributes. That is to say that they are read-only. This means that GeneXus understands that it must go to the database to search for their value and show it to the user. Let's press F5 to run our new web panel just as we have it so far. We can see that all the attractions have been printed, with the data we indicated, ID, name, country, and photo. We will also see that they have been ordered by attraction ID. The mere grid with these attributes drove GeneXus to understand that it should go to the database to navigate the attraction table, and then access country to bring the country of the attraction, as we did with the for each command, without these clauses. We can see that one of the grid properties is called BaseTRN. This property is similar to the base transaction of the for each command. In fact, to make sure that the attraction base table is selected for the grid as we want, we should indicate the base transaction just like for the for each command. In addition, note that an order property is available for the grid. This property corresponds to the order clause of the for each command. So, if we want to order by country name, as in the listing, we use the attribute country name. We press F5. And we will see that the grid is now ordered by country name. Note the navigation list of the web panel. Here it's indicated that the navigation has to be made to load the combo box of the country ID variable, which we've not used at all for the time being. And here, it indicates the navigation that will have to be made to load the grid. The list for this loading is identical to the list of a for each command. It has selected the attraction table, running it through country name, the attribute of the order property. It'll run through the entire table, and for each record in attraction to be loaded, it'll access the country table to show the country name for the attraction. So far, we haven't done anything with variables, but we wanted to use them to filter the data displayed in the grid by country and as well as by attraction name. In attraction list, we filtered by country. How do we indicate this filter for the grid? Through the property conditions. Here we're telling GeneXus that, when running through the grid base table attraction, we wanted to filter those records for which the attraction country ID is the same as the value selected by the user in the country ID combo box. We press F5. And note that by default, the combo box takes the value Brazil, and that the grid only shows an attraction in Brazil. If we select France, we see that the screen is refreshed and the grid is loaded again, this time with the attractions in France. We will probably want the combo to be first displayed without a selected value, with the attractions of all countries displayed. To do this, we must edit the combo box properties, and then set the empty item property to true. This will add a none option to the combo. It'll correspond to an empty value. So, we open the conditions property and indicate that we want to have this condition applied only when the combo's value is not empty. When it's empty, the condition should not be applied. We run it, and we see how the none value is displayed in the combo. In addition, in this case, there is no filtering for the attractions, and all of them are displayed. If now we choose France, for example, since the variable's value is not empty, the filter is applied and the attractions in France are displayed. We would also have to add the filters by attraction name that we want added to the other filter. So if in the listing we filtered in the forEach command using these two where clauses, we will add them to the grid as conditions. Attraction name greater than or equal to the value of the attraction name from variable of the form, which may be entered by the user. Once again, if the user doesn't enter a value in the variable, we will not want this filter to be applied. So we use the when clause. This clause may also be used in the where clause of the forEach command in a completely analogous way. We add the other filter, and we run again. And now we choose to see the attractions between A and F. For the case when the user selects a country, we may instruct the web panel to then sort the information by country ID and inside country ID by attraction name, or otherwise by attraction name. This is meant to optimize the search of table records. To do this, we edit the order property of the grid and write the order first, conditioned to the selection by the user of a country in the combo. In this case, the data will be filtered by that country, and also the attractions will be listed in alphabetical order for that country. If the user left the combo empty with the none value, then the following order by attraction name will be selected. We will not go into further detail here. The purpose of mentioning this was just to show that we can also condition the way in which we want to have information ordered. It works exactly like in a forEach command. We run it, and here, it ordered by attraction name. And if we select France, it'll order by France's ID, and inside it, by attraction name. In sum, attractions will always be shown in alphabetical order. If, within France's attractions, we want to see those between the letters A and F, we enter these values. We see that the grid was loaded filtering by 3 conditions we had added. To summarize what we have done so far, we implemented a web panel where, in addition to including some variables for which the user enters values, we also inserted a grid control with attributes. The attributes correspond to information in the database, so GeneXus understands that it has to search for it. A grid with attributes is like a forEach. So, we have the BaseTRN property, as in the case of a forEach, to specify the level of the transaction whose associated table we want to run through. This table is called grid base table. When we don't specify it, As it may also be the case with the for each command, then GeneXus will infer it based on the attributes used. However, we will not be considering such cases at this point. All the grid attributes will have to belong, as in a for each command, to the extended table of that base table. Just like in a for each, we order data with the order clause and filter the data to be returned by the query with one or several where clauses in order to do the same with the grid we have, respectively, the order and conditions properties. In a for each command, we program what we want to do with each record that meets the conditions inside its body. For example, in the list of tourist attractions, the print attraction command sends for print, in the output, what in this case would be the grid line. But in the case of the grid, we don't need to indicate it because it's done automatically. But let's suppose, for example, that we have a trip transaction that records the trips offered by the travel agency. In a very simplified way, suppose that for every trip, we only record the date on which it'll take place and its description, and then the tourist attractions that will be visited during that trip are recorded. Now let's also suppose that in the list of tourist attractions, we want to see the number of trips associated with each attraction. To do so, we only needed to define a numeric variable, trips, and inside the body of the for each command, that is to say, when the for each command is positioned on the record of its base table about to be processed, assign it the result of counting the trips of that attraction to then include that variable in the print block. To do the same in the web panel, we right-click on the grid and select Insert Attribute Variable, and then New Variable. And we define the trips variable. After pressing OK, we can see that it has been inserted as a grid column. We move it to the position where we want it inside the grid. Also, we change its title property so that the column title appears in uppercase. This corresponds to having inserted the variable in the print block. But where do we indicate how the calculation is done? In the case of the for each command, we did it inside its body. And to do this here, we have the system's load event. Inside it, we program what we want executed when we're positioned on a record of the grid base table, right before the corresponding line is loaded in the grid. In this case, that is where we would assign a value to the trips variable. The load event will be automatically executed for every record of the grid base table that meets the filtering conditions, immediately prior to the addition of the line to the grid. This is why, when its code is executed, we know we're working with a record from the base table and its extended table, and this inline formula. This will not count all the trips. Instead, it'll only count those from the trip attraction table that correspond to this attraction ID, that of the attraction record that we're about to load in this grid. Let's implement this in GeneXus. We've already created the trip transaction. Now we go to the events section of the web panel, and in this combo box, we're offered predefined events, that is to say, system events that are generated at specific moments, and for which we may program code. Among them is the load event. After selecting it, this code is displayed. Here we will program what we want executed every time we're positioned on a record from the attraction table before loading the line in the grid. In our case, we write the following, and we run it. The database will have to be reorganized to add the tables corresponding to the new trip transaction. Here we show the execution with a couple of trips that have already been entered. The Eiffel Tower is included in 2 trips, as is Christ the Redeemer. The Smithsonian Institute is included in 1 trip, and the Matisse Museum is also included in 1 trip. Now let's run the web panel. As we can see, it's showing exactly what we wanted. And now we want to add the sum of trips in which the attractions displayed on the grid are included. That is to say, the sum of the values in this column. To do so, we add a variable outside the grid. Let's call it total trips. Also, let's change its label caption property so that its tag is displayed in uppercase because we entered its name in lowercase. An efficient way of calculating the value that the variable will have to display is this. Every time a line is to be loaded in the grid, we should add the value of the trips variable of that line to the value calculated so far in total trips. This means that, in the load event, after calculating the value of trips, we assign to total trips the value that it contains so far, plus the value of the trips variable. For the first line to be loaded in the grid, the load event is executed for the first time. Trips is already calculated, and when total trips is going to be calculated, the current value will be 0. So in this case, total trips will take the value of trips. For the second line to be loaded, the value of trips is calculated, and then total trips will contain the previous value, to which the value of the trips variable will be added for this second line, and so on. Once the last line has been loaded, the total trips variable will have the desired value. Let's run it. We can see two things. First, the sum is being made correctly. And second, because it's a variable, it's an input method where the user may change the value, and this doesn't make sense. So the first thing to do is set it as read-only. To do this, we click on the variable in the form, and among its properties, we change its read-only variable by setting it to true. We may find it odd that trips, which is also a variable, is shown as read-only even when we did nothing in that sense. When no events have been programmed at the line level, and when they are not run through by code, grid variables will always be read-only. We will be seeing this in detail further ahead. Let's also see what happens if, for example, we filter by France. Instead of showing a total of 3, it shows 9, which is the sum of the value displayed before, 6, plus the 3 that it should be displaying now. Why did this happen? After changing one of the filter variables, the web panel loaded the grid again, meaning that it queried the attraction table in the database again, and it executed the load event again for every record that met the filter's criteria. The problem is that the total trips variable should have been reset, returning it to 0 before the start of the grid load. Where do we do this? In the refresh event. This system event takes place every time that the web panel is going to be loaded, right before accessing the database to look for data for loading it to the grid. That is, immediately prior to the execution of the load events for each line that will be loaded. So we open the Events tab and select Refresh from the combo. This is the point where the variable must be set to 0. Note that the order in which the events are written is not important. Here, we will only indicate the code that will be run when each one of them is triggered. Now let's press F5. We will see that the total number of trips is now read-only. To run this web panel for the first time, 3 events were triggered in sequence. The start event, which is run only when the web panel is opened for the first time, the refresh event, which set the variable to 0, and the load event, as many times as lines were to be loaded in the grid. In this case, there were 7. Now, if we filter by a country, such as France, we see that the number of trips is correctly calculated. Changing the value of a variable that affects the conditions that must be met by the records to be loaded in the grid causes the refresh event to be triggered again, and therefore, the total trips variable is reset to 0. And the database is accessed to filter and load the records in the grid once again. Therefore, the load event is triggered again for every attraction in France that is to be loaded. If now we select to view the attractions from E to F, the screen is refreshed again. The total trips variable is reset to 0 once again in the refresh event, and the grid base table and its extended table are run through again, this time retrieving only one record, so the load event will be executed just once. If we take a look at the web panel that we've implemented so far, we can see that it now looks like the object created by the work-with pattern applied to the attraction transaction. Obviously, this object was a web panel. Here, a single variable was used to filter. What's most interesting about this is that in addition to allowing us to filter the grid data, The work with includes the option to run actions over the data. For example, updating an attraction's data or deleting the attraction or adding a new attraction. To this end, the pattern inserted two controls at the grid line level and another one outside. In any of these three cases, the action associated with each control consists in calling the attraction transaction, sending it, as parameter, the mode in which the transaction must be opened if it's called to update, delete, or insert data. In the first two cases, since update or delete will correspond to events of one line, the ID of the line attraction will be sent as a second parameter to the transaction, in order to update the data of that attraction or in order to delete that attraction. For the insert control outside the grid, 0 will be sent as a second parameter because the attractions in insert are auto-numbered. This is why the pattern modified the attraction transaction by adding the parm rule, which, among other things, as we can see, receives two variables. The mode variable is a standard variable in transactions, 3-character, and which accepts one of four values indicated in the TRN mode enumerated domain: insert, INS, update, UPD, delete, DLT, and display, DSP. Upon receiving one of these four values, the transaction will know the mode in which it should be opened. In addition, it'll receive as a second parameter the attraction ID in the attraction ID variable for updating, deleting, or displaying. In our web panel, we will implement one of these actions over the transactions. For example, update. The idea is to show an example of actions over the data. We will have to insert a control in the grid. In the case of the pattern, a character variable called update is inserted. It's assigned the update text that we see at runtime. But we will choose to insert an image, which we must insert in the KB to start with. We will call it update icon. Now we go to the web panel and drag the attribute variable control from the toolbox to the last grid column and define the new variable as update of the image type instead of character. We remove the title so that it's not displayed as a column title, and then we need to load that variable with the image we've just inserted in the KB. Where do we do this? If the image changed according to the grid line, we would then do it in the load event. But since the image will never vary and will remain the same for every line, then a good option is to do it in the start event, which will be run only once, when the web panel is opened. So we insert the start event, and there we type the following. And as a method parameter, we type the name of the image in the KB, that is, update icon. Let's see it at runtime. Now we need to associate an event with that image, so that when the user clicks on it, the event is triggered and its code is run, where we will invoke the attraction transaction. There are several options available to do this. One of them is to go to the Events tab, and with Insert Event on the left, we can see all the names of the controls we've inserted in the form. We choose the one desired, the update variable, and on the right, we will see the events that may be associated with it, such as the click event. This will make it so that, when the user clicks on the image for a line, the code that we type inside this event will be executed. In such cases, what we want to do is to invoke the attraction transaction. We will pass the update mode, that is to say, the update value of the TRN mode enumerated domain we saw before, and the attraction ID value corresponding to the grid line where the click was made. Let's run it. First, we see that the column of the trips variable is now editable. We had not defined it as read-only explicitly because we had noticed, upon the execution, that it was already done. As we said, grid variables are first added as read-only except when an event is defined at the line level, as in this case, or under other circumstances that we won't get into now. Let's set it as read-only. And we'll run it again. We now select a country, like France, and now we click on the update image for the Eiffel Tower, In Update, we see the name of the transaction. Now we modify something. For example, we can change the T in tower from uppercase to lowercase. We now confirm. And since the work with pattern, which we have not seen, has added a return command to the transaction to return to the caller, we will return to the web panel. This return command is similar to invoking the web panel for the first time, so the start event will be executed in it, followed by the refresh and load events as many times as the number of records that will be loaded. This is why we see that, upon returning, all the attractions are loaded without any filters. What would happen if we hadn't added the attraction ID attribute in the grid? By clicking on the image to update, what attraction ID would have been sent as a parameter to the transaction? The answer is, it would not have that value to send. Since it'll be used in an event at the line level, which will be triggered after the lines have been loaded, we cannot remove attraction ID from the grid. Because here, we are no longer in the database. The grid has saved, upon the loading with the load event, all its common values and nothing else. A later event will work only on the data loaded in the grid. So, if we don't want to see this column in the grid, we can hide it. It'll continue to be present, although hidden. To this end, we use the visible property with its value set to false. And we run it. In the following video, we will see what happens with an event at the line level that changes the value of a grid variable. We will see a web panel without a grid, but with attributes in the form. We will summarize concepts on everything we've seen so far. We will see web panels without a base table, and we will mention more advanced use cases of web panels and their characteristics.